I was sitting in my small living room drinking a cup of warm tea when my phone buzzed. I didn't expect anything serious. Most times, Daniel only sent short updates about work or asked if I needed anything from the store. But when I opened the message, my hand paused halfway in the air. Dad, I know you bought us a house, but my mother-in-law doesn't want you to come to Thanksgiving dinner. I read it twice, slowly, carefully. The words felt sharp, even though they were typed so softly. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. I didn't want him to feel guilty or pulled in two directions, so I typed the simplest reply I could think of. Okay, and I pressed send. The room became very quiet after that. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't even bother warming it again. I just sat there, letting the message sink into me like a stone sinking into water. Daniel had always been a gentle boy, even as a child. When his mother passed years ago, I raised him alone. I never complained. I never asked for anything. I worked long hours, saved every spare coin, and years later, when he wanted to start his own family, I used almost all my savings to buy him and Rena their house. I told him it was my gift, a father's blessing. I didn't buy it to control them. I bought it so he would never struggle the way I did. But now I sat alone in my small rented place, while the house I paid for was preparing for a Thanksgiving dinner without me. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I thought about Rena. She was always polite, but polite in a distant way, like someone holding a door open while making sure you don't walk too close to them. And her mother, Mrs. Cade, she was the type who could say, "Good morning," and still make you feel unwelcome. She had a sharp way of looking at me, as if I was part of the old world she didn't want in her daughter's new life. I never argued. I believed peace was better than pride. But sitting there with that message in my hand, I felt something shift in me, quietly, without noise. For years, I let myself be brushed aside, thinking it was for the sake of harmony. I told myself it didn't matter if I wasn't invited to small gatherings. I told myself it didn't matter if my seat at the table was slowly moving backwards. But Thanksgiving? A day meant for family? A day filled with warmth, food, stories, and laughter? A day where a father should be welcome? I placed the phone on the table. I felt no anger, only a clear, steady understanding washing over me. This wasn't about Thanksgiving dinner. This was about years of being the one who always gave and never asked for anything in return. That night, as I sat alone in my quiet home, I realized something I had never let myself think before. I had been taken for granted for far too long, and for the first time in many years, I felt something new rising in me, something strong, calm, and certain. I knew things were going to change, but not with shouting, not with anger, not with fights, with a choice I had never made before, a choice for myself. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The message from Daniel still sat in my mind, not heavy, but clear, like a reminder of something I had ignored for too long. I walked to the kitchen, made myself a small breakfast, and ate quietly. My house was always quiet. It had been that way for years. As I washed my plate, memories began returning to me, not in a rush, more like pages of an old book opening slowly. When Daniel was a boy, he used to follow me around everywhere. He'd sit beside me in the workshop, playing with wood scraps while I repaired chairs for neighbors. He would look up at me with wide eyes and say, "Dad, one day I'll buy you a big house." I would laugh and tell him that him being happy was enough. After he grew up and met Rena, things changed, not suddenly, but quietly. At first, everything felt normal. Rena was polite. She smiled, thanked me for small things, and spoke with a soft tone. But there was always a wall between us. a wall she kept straight and strong. The first time I noticed it was the day I brought over a box of kitchen supplies for their new home. I was proud. I had saved for months to buy them. When I handed the box to Rena, she gave a small smile and said, "Oh, you didn't need to do that." Her voice wasn't unkind, but there was something sharp behind the words. Something that told me she didn't like surprises from me. Her mother, Mrs. Cade, made it even clearer. At family gatherings, she would sit stiffly, correcting the way I placed my fork or how long I talked. If I brought a dish, she would taste it politely, then push her plate away like she had tasted something from the past that didn't belong in her present. She always had a way of reminding me that I wasn't part of their world. But Daniel never noticed. He was caught between trying to make everyone happy and trying not to cause tension. He would look at me sometimes, almost apologetically, but he never said anything. I didn't blame him. He was trying to protect the life he was building. When he and Rena married, I made the biggest decision of my life. I spent years saving money, working overtime, selling old belongings, even taking small jobs on weekends to buy them a house. I told everyone it was my gift to the newlyweds. But deep down, it was my way of giving Daniel the comfort I never had. The day I handed him the keys, he hugged me so tightly that I felt all the hard years melt away. It was one of the happiest days of my life. But over time, the house became more theirs and less mine. Not the ownership, but the feeling. I visited less often. I stayed quiet during conversations. I stood at the edge of family events like a guest instead of a father. I told myself it was normal. I told myself this was life. I told myself silence was easier. But yesterday's message made something clear. My silence hadn't kept peace. It had only made me invisible. That morning, as I sat near the window watching the sunrise, I finally understood the truth about all those years. I had given everything, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to give something to myself. Thanksgiving week arrived faster than I expected. Everywhere I went, people were buying turkeys, carrying shopping bags, laughing with family members, or loading cars with boxes of decorations. The whole town felt warm and busy. My home, however, stayed quiet. I didn't plan a special meal. I didn't buy anything for the holiday. For the first time in my life, I wasn't preparing to be with family. And strangely, I didn't feel lost, just steady, calm, almost thoughtful. I cleaned the house slowly, moving from room to room. As I dusted old shelves, I found things I hadn't touched in years. Family photos, Daniel's childhood drawings, birthday cards he wrote with his tiny handwriting. I held them carefully, smiling at the memories. There was so much love in those early years, so much closeness. But life changes, people change, and sometimes distance doesn't come from shouting, it comes from silence. I placed the memories back into their box and moved to my small desk. There was a drawer I hadn't opened in a long time. Inside it were neatly folded documents, receipts, old tax papers, and the thick folder labeled House Deed, the house I bought for Daniel. I pulled out the folder and placed it on the table. My hands rested on it for a moment. I didn't open it, I just stared, letting the weight of everything settle in me. That house represented years of sacrifice, years of work, years of believing that giving more meant being appreciated more. But life doesn't work that way. I wasn't angry, not even for a second. If anything, I felt clearer than ever. I realized that I had tied too much of myself to that house, too much of my hope, too much of my identity as a father. I gave something huge, and in return, I asked for almost nothing. That was my mistake, not theirs. People don't respect what they think is endless. After a while, I put the folder aside and stood up. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water, drinking it slowly while looking out the window. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children were playing outside. A man across the street was hanging lights on his house. Traditions continued for everyone else, but this year, mine would be different. Later that afternoon, I put on my jacket and stepped outside. I walked around the block, letting the cool breeze clear my thoughts. I passed a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. I passed families loading groceries into cars. Everyone seemed to be preparing for something joyful. I realized something important during that walk. Being alone was not the same as being unwanted. Sometimes being alone is the first step to finding yourself again. When I reached home, I felt lighter. I sat at my table again, pulled out the house folder, and this time I opened it. I didn't make any decisions. I didn't rush. I just read through each document, each signature, each detail, reminding myself of everything I had contributed. I wasn't reviewing the papers out of anger. I was reviewing them because I finally wanted to understand where I stood in my own life. Thanksgiving was only a day away, and for the first time in many years, I was preparing for it in my own way. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a cold, gentle breeze. I woke up early, not because I had plans, but because my mind felt unusually clear. I made a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and tea, and sat at my kitchen table. The street outside was lively. I could hear children laughing, cars starting, and families heading to different homes, filled with warmth and celebration. For years, I had been part of that noise, moving from house to house, carrying food, fixing something broken, helping where help was needed. I thought that was what made a family strong. But as I watched through my window, I realized something important. I had been a helper, but not always a father, not in the way that mattered. People came to me when they needed a problem solved. They called me when something required money, time, or effort. And I always showed up. I never asked questions, never set boundaries, never said no. I believed that giving without limits proved love. But love doesn't need you to disappear. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. My eyes drifted toward the thick folder still sitting on my table, the house deed. I had kept it there since the day before, telling myself I just wanted to understand things better. But the truth was deeper. That folder was a symbol of everything I had done and everything I had lost along the way. I opened it again and ran my fingers across my own signature. I thought about the long nights I worked to afford that house, the sacrifices I made, the dreams I put on hold. When I gave the keys to Daniel, I felt proud. But over time, that pride turned into quiet worry. I had wanted to give him a foundation. Instead, I had given everyone else permission to ignore me. A soft knock of memory returned, one I hadn't thought about in years. It was the day Rena's mother came to see the house for the first time. She walked through the rooms with a stiff smile, nodding slowly at every corner. "This is, nice," she said in a tone that made nice sound like barely acceptable. She never thanked me. Not once. She acted like the house had appeared out of thin air, like Daniel and Rena had built it with their own hands. I didn't say anything that day. I swallowed the feeling as I always did. But now, alone in my quiet kitchen, the memory no longer stung. It simply made sense. Respect is not given to those who never ask for it. I closed the folder softly and placed both hands on top of it. My fingers were steady. My heart was calm. I wasn't angry at Daniel. I wasn't even angry at Rena or her mother. People act according to the boundaries they see. I had shown them none. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. A family was loading pies into their car, laughing as they rushed around. The scene warmed me, not with jealousy, but with clarity. I finally understood something I had ignored for too long. I mattered too. Not for what I gave, not for what I paid for, not for what I fixed or solved. I mattered simply because I existed. Thanksgiving no longer felt like a day I was missing out on. It felt like the day I finally woke up. When I turned back toward the table, toward the folder, toward the life I had slowly allowed others to shape for me, I knew I was finally ready. Ready to make a decision. Not out of pain, but out of understanding. Thanksgiving afternoon settled in quietly around my home. The sky was soft and pale, and the air carried the smell of food from houses up and down the street. I sat at my table for a long moment, looking at the deed folder one last time. My mind was calm, clearer than it had been in years. I wasn't thinking about anger. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about balance, something I had never given myself. I reached for my phone and scrolled through a few contacts before stopping at one number I hadn't called in a long while. A local housing advisor. Someone who helped me when I first bought Daniel's house. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then pressed the call button. The conversation was simple, calm, straightforward. I explained that I wanted to update the ownership details of the property, not because of drama, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I wanted to protect myself, my work, my savings, my future. I listened carefully as he explained my options, my rights, and the steps I could take. When the call ended, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel guilt. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. I filled out the documents he sent to my email, reading each line slowly, not rushing, not second-guessing myself. When I finished signing everything, I placed the deed folder neatly into an envelope. My hands didn't shake. My breath stayed steady. It was time to stop living like a visitor in my own life. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed again. A message from Daniel. "Dad, are you okay? You've been quiet since yesterday." I looked at the message for a moment. I could imagine him in the middle of their Thanksgiving dinner, slipping away to check on me. Maybe he finally felt the weight of that first message. Maybe he finally noticed I wasn't always going to be the quiet one who swallowed everything. I typed back slowly, "I'm fine, just making a few changes for myself." He replied almost instantly, "What kind of changes?" This time I didn't hide anything. I told him the truth, but gently, without blame, without bitterness. I explained I was taking steps to reclaim what was mine, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted to respect myself. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him he didn't need to choose sides. I only needed him to understand that I had allowed myself to fade into the background, and I was done doing that. There was a long pause before another message arrived. "Dad, I didn't know you felt this way. I'm sorry. I should have protected you more." I felt tears press behind my eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, I smiled softly. Protecting me was never his job. Protecting myself was. I stood from the table, walked to the window, and watched the lights of distant houses glow against the darkening sky. I realized that this Thanksgiving, even though I was alone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. No shouting, no bitterness. Just a man finally standing in his own space, holding his own worth. And as I sat back down, the last thought that settled in my heart was the simplest one. I had finally taken my final step, the one that led back to myself. In the days after Thanksgiving, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I woke up knowing I had finally chosen myself. No anger, no shouting, just a quiet power that came from taking back my voice. I moved through my days lighter, clearer, and more certain of who I was. A week later, Daniel came to see me. He stood at my door, looking unsure, and said softly, "Dad, I'm sorry. I never understood how much you gave." I rested a hand on his shoulder and told him the truth. I wasn't angry. I had simply reached a point in life where I refused to let myself disappear anymore. We talked, really talked, in a way we hadn't for years. And in that moment, I realized something important. Reclaiming your worth is the greatest revenge of all. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting revenge stories.